Hello and welcome to this edition of Kasbah Talks. Jet Airways, Kingfisher Airlines, SpiceJet once, and now Go Air, or you can call it by the new name Go First. पिछले 10 सालों में 4 एयरलाइंस तो फाइनेंशियल ट्रबल में ऐसी जा चुकी हैं और उसके बाद रीजनल नाम अलग से हैं. तो मैंने सोचा कि क्यों ना किसी से ये पूछा जाए कि इतना मुश्किल क्यों है एक एयरलाइन चलाना. और मुझे तभी एहसास हुआ कि नो वन बेटर देन माय फ्रेंड केजी विश्वनाथ who's spent almost 25 plus years in
25 years,
aviation,
yes.
now with an aviation consultant and a startup mentor, and has worked around airlines. KG, first of all, thanks a lot for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
एक बड़ा सिंपल सवाल है, why are so many airlines shutting down or have shut down in the past?
So the simple answer to that, Utkarsh, is airline promoters have always thought about this business more as a glamour business. They've thought about this business as a quick way to make money and exit. And in the bargain, I think the whole vision somewhere gets lost. Airline is a very complex business. लोगों को लग रहा है eventually it's just a bus service between point A to point B, but it's got much more beyond, right? Right from the right choice of aircraft, or what's the kind of pricing at which you're buying these aircraft, what are the routes that you're going to plan, what is the network, how many hours you typically utilize these aircraft, what's the kind of team that you have, what is their experience in basically running this business on a day-to-day basis. Unless you have all of these boxes ticked, it becomes very difficult for you to run a successful airline in a sustained manner. Now there have been airline promoters who've got some aspects of this right, but the others they've not. There are airlines who've got all of these right, but obviously the promoter thought process has been very different, which has eventually led to their downfall. So it's a various set of reasons which basically has led to this kind of a financial trouble. But I would imagine that the successful airlines are those which have got 90% of all of these things right almost all the time. Obviously there are slippages, there are unforeseen circumstances, there is COVID which happened, there is 9/11 which happened, but outside of that, if you are able to consistently drive all of these process improvements and get these things right, you can easily become successful.
Vishay, the question here is how much margin for error is there in aviation versus any other industry? क्योंकि बहुत सारे इंडस्ट्रीज हैं भाई, वहाँ भी गलतियाँ होती हैं, लेकिन स्कोप होता है उनको सुधारने का. हाउ मच मार्जिन ऑफ एरर इज देयर इन एन एविएशन इंडस्ट्री कि अगर आपने एक गलती कर दी तो उसको सुधारने का कितना स्कोप है हमारे पास?
So the margins in the airline business are very thin. They're actually wafer thin, single digit numbers. Globally, I've seen very few airlines get into double digits in terms of net margins. So even if your slippage is as much as 3 to 4%, you can end up turning a profitable year into a loss-making year. So the margin of error is very, very low, very high as such. Having said that, it's important for people to think about this business as a long-term business. So there could be 2 years which could go bad, but if you do things right, even during those 2-3 years, your next 5 years become better. I can give you 2 or 3 very, very logical examples, right? There are 2 big airlines, who I always admire. One of them being Emirates and one being Singapore Airlines. These 2 airlines buy airplanes when things are bad. Now it's counterintuitive because when you know that things are bad, why would you typically invest in assets, putting millions and millions of dollars? The point here is when things are going bad, the price of airplanes become very, very cheap. The price of leases become very, very cheap. Lessors become desperate. Manufacturers become desperate. That's when you tend to drive a great bargain.
Is that the pitch which Vinay Dubey has given to Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, that we were in a time when the prices were right?
So in the case of Akasa, and hats off to them, great respect for the kind of airline that they have created. I think what was relevant is the timing, right? There was huge market which was available once Jet went down, and somebody had to come and fill it. IndiGo obviously had their own plans in terms of their growth strategy, and as you said, Go was struggling, Spice is still struggling, Air India was going through this whole privatization exercise. So there was a space which was available for an airline to come in and take. All the same, Boeing had this whole issue about their 737 MAX, and they were looking for a kind of an anchor customer with whom they can typically grow their market. And India historically has been a growth market for both Boeing and Airbus. So I think all of these things came together. Vinay, with his experience globally as well as having worked in India and a great team that he's got, managed to strike a fantastic deal with Boeing, I would imagine. But what was important is for Boeing to support a new carrier, you needed a strong balance sheet. You needed a strong quote unquote investor, which is where somebody like RJ came in. And the muscle power which he put in behind this idea is what ensured that Akasa takes off swiftly, and their growth trajectory has been phenomenal since then.
Many people ask कि इंडिगो ने ऐसा क्या करा कि वो सक्सेसफुल हो गई. What is it that IndiGo did right? Is it again what you said कि 90% boxes टिके, या जो स्टार्टिंग फाउंडेशन बना, जो टीम बनी उस समय राकेश गंगवाल की, राहुल भाटिया की, वो उनने जिस तरीके के डिसीजन लिए वो बहुत आगे काम आए?
I think it's a combination of all of these factors, right? IndiGo is an airline which consistently does things right. IndiGo is not an airline which has just got good pricing for the airplane and everything else is, like a typical airline. What IndiGo does is a cut above the rest in every single aspect of how they do business, right? Whether it's their attention to detail in terms of on-time performance, whether it's how soon they're able to turn around the airplane, how many hours they're able to utilize the airplane in a day, because all of these eventually results in a lower cost per seat, right? Eventually, what an airline sells is a seat between point A to point B. The airline operations has to be so tight that it has to reduce the cost per seat so much so that it can actually go out there in the market and compete for that traveler. So what IndiGo has done is it has done 99% of these things right consistently for the last 15 years. I think that consistency is the key word here.
Can you give me any example for a common man who can understand, this is what IndiGo does versus this is what the industry standards are, and that's why IndiGo is a cut above the rest?
So I can give you 2 or 3 examples, right? IndiGo started in 2006 or 2007. It's been 15 years since they've been in operations. Before that, whenever an Indian airline used to place aircraft orders, they used to place 50, 10, 15, 20, 25. And you know that, once you start pushing the boundaries and start to make a big order, whether it's for airplanes or trucks or cars or whatever, right, the pricing becomes totally different, right? IndiGo, even when it was a paper airline, decided very boldly that it has to go and order 100 aircraft, right? Suddenly when you talk about 100 aircraft, the economics start to change. It's no longer a 10 rupee product. You start buying it at 6 rupees or 7 rupees. So from day one, even before the airline got started, they had purchased aircraft jiska cost of operation is going to be 30% cheaper than any other airline who was operating at that point in time in the market. What it also did, before even it started operations, it recruited some very, very good people who understood the airline business and who were starting to negotiate the key terms, whether it's for aircraft purchase or aircraft lease or aircraft maintenance, so on and so forth, right? And it's about the experience that you bring to the table in terms of how you negotiate a particular agreement, which makes a difference between, what's your engineering cost going to be on an ongoing basis. What IndiGo also did very clearly is it had 2 distinct teams. There was one team who was only looking at the strategic direction of where this business needs to be headed, and there was another operational team which was headed by Aditya, of course, who ran the day-to-day operations. Right? Once a strategic guy starts to run operational issues, it's curtains for you. That you will have to have people who are suited for the job and who do those things on a day in and day out basis, which is what makes it very, very successful today.
So what now, because we've spoken about what Akasa can do, what is right for them, what is right with IndiGo does. Now let's talk about the airline which has now created Ripple, which is Go First and Go Air. And I remember it's been almost 7, 8, 9 months or an year that somebody who's tracking the aviation industry knows कि बहुत problem तो है.
Exactly.
अब वो problem कैसे solve होगी वो देखने वाली बात है. Pratt & Whitney, अच्छा, is it only Pratt & Whitney or you think Pratt & Whitney was the final nail in the coffin?
So I would imagine that post-COVID, a lot of airlines have faced financial issues, right? IndiGo, by virtue of all the good work that they have done in the past, had access to cash. They had cash on the balance sheet, and they also had equity which was sitting in its airplanes for them to be able to release, to be able to drive or take care of losses post the COVID situation. While in the case of Go or SpiceJet, that was not the case. The promoters had consistently pumped money to be able to sustain the airline losses, and COVID was actually a big negative impact on most of these airlines. And Pratt and Whitney, of course, like you said, is a nail in the coffin. But the thing I would argue is Pratt and Whitney is an issue which is not just plaguing Go, it is plaguing the industry as a whole, right? IndiGo is also facing the same issues. I'm pretty sure that Air India to some extent is also facing those issues. A lot of lessors are facing such issues, and globally Pratt and Whitney seems to have this problem which it's trying to resolve as such. I think the consistent impact of not having enough cash flows to be able to remain current is what caused delays from Pratt and Whitney's side to supply spare engines, which is what started to cause the spiral.
So, as you said, the promoters had pushed in, but do you think that the promoters gave up after a point of time? SpiceJet, I don't think Ajay Singh has anything else, but obviously in the case of Go Air, you're talking about the Vadias, you have Britannia, you have Bombay Dine, you have a lot of other businesses. But do you think that after a point of time, the Vadias decided कि भाई अब इससे ज़्यादा नहीं लगा सकते?
I think this is the same case with Kingfisher also, right? At a point in time, it was the liquor business which was actually driving the airline business. But beyond a point in time, all of these other successful businesses have their own independent board, they have their shareholders and investors, and it is not right on the part of the promoter to continue to divert money from other businesses to pump into a loss-making entity as such. A similar kind of thought process obviously would have dawned on the Vadias, which is the reason why I would imagine they decided to pull the plug.
How hopeful are you after seeing the success anyhow in the IBC proceedings, and especially in the case of Jet Airways, that Go First will fly again?
So I think when you look at IBC, you will have to look at it industry by industry, and you can't generalize. Though I think on paper it would seem that the IBC process for Jet has succeeded, I don't think it drives enough value for the buyer.
Yeah.
Because the airline that we are talking about, in a leased model, there is very little assets that
Which
typically airlines would own.
Yeah.
So there is nothing that a potential new investor is buying. And there is another risk of what are the kind of undiscovered liabilities which would eventually devolve on them, which is a big risk for any investor to look at. I am not so sure if investors will come forward to be able to participate or even take haircuts or even, let's say, buy out quote unquote assets of Go Air, because they have not seen any tangible success in the Jet Airways process. Even though the process is over, then you can see that they've still not started their operations. There are so many other liabilities which are starting to surface at this point in time. So it's going to be difficult.
If you look at, say, a Delhi-Bombay airfare and the movement in it in the past, say, 4 or 5 years, it's almost hovered around the same price bracket. But the fuel prices have gone up substantially.
Yeah.
And the moment it goes up thoda sa bhi zyada, so there is immense noise around of how the airlines right now are looting.
Correct.
Do you think our expectation of a 2.5, 3.5 thousand Delhi Bombay flight is actually reasonable?
I think it's unreal, purely because the Indian customers have been spoiled for choice. There have been very irrational, quote unquote, airline operators who have, kind of tried to tickle the market by offering cheap fares to be able to ensure that there are more people who start to fly over a period in time. I think the eventual pricing power in the market is largely a function of demand and supply balance, right? If at any given point in time the supply in the market starts to outgrow the underlying demand, that's where this whole discounting starts to come through in the market. Historically, if you look at airfares in India over the last 15-20 years, for example, airfares have actually gone down by 40%. Right? I still remember in the 90s and in the 2000s where the aviation industry was at its infancy, the number of travelers were also kind of limited. At that point in time, people wouldn't mind paying 15,000 rupees for a Bombay Delhi ticket, right? Because the supply was not there. But over a period in time, there was too much capacity which started to come into the market, and once the demand supply equation starts to get imbalanced is when airlines have no choice but to start to offer lower fares. But if you come to the actual math of it, right, and let's say we take an A320 or a 737 aircraft, which is the standard size of aircraft today in the market, to operate this aircraft for 1 hour, assuming that it's doing a 12-hour kind of a utilization in a day, to operate this aircraft for 1 hour in a day is going to cost you anywhere between 6 to 7 lakh rupees, right? So let's take an example of a Bombay Delhi flight. It's a 2-hour flight one way. So you basically end up spending 13 lakhs to 14 lakh rupees to operate that aircraft. That's the cost of operating it.
This is only the fuel cost or everything?
This is the total cost,
Total.
right? Fuel cost is roughly around 40%, 40 to 45%. So out of 13 lakhs, you take 45%, you come to around what? 6 lakh rupees.
Yeah.
6 lakh rupees if you now divide by 180 seats, which is the maximum capacity.
Yeah.
Right? 180 seats, 6 lakhs, if you divide, it's 3,000 rupees only for fuel cost. For a Bombay Delhi trip, only for fuel cost. And if the consumer is now expecting that he gets a 3,000 rupee or a 3,500 rupee ticket for a Bombay Delhi flight, for an airline it doesn't even cover the fuel cost. Obviously speaking, not all seats are going to be sold at 3 to 3,500 rupees. The average fare or the average yield that an airline is going to drive for that particular flight is roughly around 6,500 to 7,000 rupees as such.
But that also, I think, by the math only
It's just about going to
just
cover
covering
your cost,
it.
right? Which is the reason why, if you look at the airline businesses in India, it's highly seasonal, right? If you look at the third quarter of the fourth quarter of the calendar year and the second quarter of the calendar year, that's typically the time where demand is higher than supply. That's the time where airlines are typical to use their pricing power, right? So you have two very weak quarters where you kind of end up making losses. So the secret is to minimize your losses in your bad times and maximize your profits in the peak quarters.
So let me now compare this globally.
Yeah.
Suppose distance covered versus money versus airfare. How much difference is there?
So globally, the airfares or the RASK, which is the revenue per available seat kilometer, is around 3 times that of what it is in India.
Almost 3 times.
Almost 3 times. And if you look at the CASK or the cost, it's around 30-40% higher in India. So it's kind of a double whammy.
So इसके साथ हमारी समय समाप्ति की घोषणा हो सकती है. Vishi, thanks a lot for speaking to us.
No problem.
I hope that you guys enjoyed the conversation, so I can convince him once again to talk about the other aviation issues and get to him again. But till then, thanks a lot for speaking to us.
Pleasure.
Making us understand actually कि हो क्या रहा है.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks
Appreciate
a
it.
lot.